Hello, fellow night owl, and welcome to tonight's bedtime history session. Whether you're joining for the first time or back for another tale, I'm so glad you've chosen to spend some time with me tonight. Before we begin our journey back in time, to the bizarre realm of medieval medicine, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. We'd love to know where in the world our community of nocturnal historians reside. And if you find yourself enjoying this type of calm historical storytelling, please consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Now, make yourself comfortable, nestle under the covers if you'd like, and let your mind drift back with me, back through the centuries, to a very different time, the Middle Ages. Picture in your mind's eye a small, rustic village. Dirt paths wind between simple houses of wood and thatch. Smoke rises from cooking fires as peasants toil in the surrounding fields, their backs bent under the weight of their labours. The sun hangs low in the sky, casting long shadows across the hamlet as another day draws to a close. But amidst the usual sights and sounds of village life, there is an undercurrent of unease tonight. Worried whispers pass between neighbours. Furtive glances are cast at one cottage in particular. For inside, a young man lies fevered and aching, his body racked by a dread disease. The Black Death has come to call. The year is 1348, and this is the scene playing out in countless villages and towns across Europe as the most notorious pandemic of the Middle Ages begins its relentless march. One by one, communities will be brought to their knees as the plague scythes through the population like a merciless reaper. But before we zoom out to consider the wider toll of this catastrophe, let us linger here a moment longer in this one afflicted household to consider the human tragedy at the heart of it all. The family is gathered around the bedside of their eldest son, his once strong body now laid low by pestilence. Just days ago, he was out working the fields alongside his father, dreaming of the future, making plans for the harvest, and perhaps a family of his own someday. How quickly those dreams have turned to dust. It began with a fever and chills that racked his body. Then the aches set in, a deep throbbing pain in his joints and his head. But worst of all were the swellings, the dreadful buboes that gave this strain of plague its name. Hard, painful lumps that arose in his groin, under his arms, on his neck, steadily growing, turning black, sometimes rupturing to ooze foul pus and blood. His mother has hardly left his side, mopping his brow with a damp cloth, murmuring prayers, desperately mixing poultices and remedies in hopes of fighting off this unseen assailant. But in her heart, a grim certainty is taking hold. She has heard the rumours. She knows the signs. The Black Death does not relinquish its victims. In desperation, the family has even called upon the local healer, a bent old man who arrives reeking of garlic and muttering incantations. He casts stones and bones, applies foul-smelling ointments, lights candles and chants spells, but his arsenal of folk remedies and superstitions is woefully outmatched. After all, what good are leeches and bloodletting against a foe so implacable, a contagion so virulent that it can strike down the sturdiest soul in a matter of days? In a time before microscopes and petri dishes, before the very notion of germ theory, what hope is there? And so, with a final rattling gasp, the young man surrenders his spirit. His family is left to collapse in grief, their anguished sobs echoing into the night. There will be no funeral, no gatherings to celebrate his memory and bid him farewell. Such practices have been banned for fear of spreading the pestilence further. Instead, he will be buried hastily in a shallow grave, or perhaps even consigned to the flames of a mass pyre already piled high with victims. His family's tragedy is far from unique. All across this village, all across the continent, similar scenes of heartbreak and despair are unfolding. As the Black Death tightens its grip, it will leave no life untouched. In the coming months, this village will lose over half its population, a staggering toll repeated in hamlet after hamlet, town after town. Fields will go untended, livestock will roam untamed, as able-bodied labourers succumb. The social order will strain and buckle, as lords perish alongside peasants, as those who should provide leadership and guidance are themselves laid low. Some who contract the disease may be lucky enough to survive, but they will bear the scars, both physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives. Fingers, toes, even limbs may be lost to gangrene. Minds will be haunted by the memory of loved ones, of entire families, snuffed out like so many candles. And in the aftermath, as the shattered survivors emerge to pick up the pieces, they will find their world irrevocably changed. With so many dead, labour will be in short supply, shifting the balance of power between lord and serf. Long-standing social structures will begin to crumble, paving the way for uprisings and revolts in years to come. Even the church, that unshakable bedrock of medieval life, will find its authority challenged as prayers seem to go unanswered, and pious men of God perish alongside sinners. Some will see the plague as a punishment from the Almighty, a great reckoning for the sins of man. Others will question how a loving God could inflict such suffering upon his children. These are the far-reaching consequences that will ripple out from our single tragic village, from the heartbreak of one family multiplied by thousands upon thousands. The Black Death will serve as a grim reminder of how fragile life could be in an age before modern medicine, when the very air you breathed could spell your doom. But the sad truth is, even in the years between these great pandemic waves, the shadow of illness and death was never far away for medieval people. In our next section, we'll take a closer look at some of the endemic diseases that made surviving to adulthood a feat in itself, as well as some of the medical practices that often did more harm than good. I do hope you'll stay with me. For now, though, let us offer a moment of silence for all those lives cut short, for all those families torn asunder by the merciless plague. As we drift off to sleep in our safe, comfortable modern world, let us hold a space of gratitude in our hearts for the medical knowledge and treatments we so often take for granted. Until next time, dear listener, I wish you a restful night and pleasant dreams. This is your host, bidding you good night. The villagers had seen their share of hardships over the years, from failed crops to harsh winters, but nothing could prepare them for the devastation wrought by the Black Death. As the plague tore through their tight-knit community, it left a wake of suffering and sorrow that would scar them for generations to come. Amidst the chaos and despair, there were a few brave souls who risked their own lives to care for the sick and dying. The local priest, Father John, worked tirelessly to offer comfort and last rites to those stricken by the plague. He would enter the homes of the afflicted, his face covered with a crude beak-like mask, stuffed with sweet-smelling herbs, which he believed would protect him from the disease. Armed with little more than prayer and a few meagre supplies, Father John did what he could to ease the suffering of his parishioners. One such parishioner was a young mother named Agnes. When her husband fell ill with the telltale signs of the plague, she knew there was little hope for his recovery. She watched helplessly as he writhed in agony, his body racked with fever and pain. The buboes, those grotesque swellings in his armpits and groin, grew larger and more inflamed with each passing day. Agnes did her best to keep him comfortable, bathing his brow with cool water and murmuring soothing words. But in the end, the plague proved too strong, and he succumbed to the disease. Bereft and alone, Agnes now had to face the daunting task of caring for their 3 young children on her own. She worried constantly about keeping them safe from the illness that had claimed their father. The village was a shadow of its former self, with so many families shattered by loss. The once bustling market square now stood eerily quiet, as people feared to gather in crowds lest they catch the plague. As the death toll mounted, the local authorities grew increasingly desperate to contain the spread of the disease. They ordered the homes of the infected to be boarded up, with the sick and their families trapped inside to await their fate. Healthy villagers were instructed to stay indoors and avoid contact with their neighbours. But these measures did little to stem the tide of death and misery. Agnes lived in constant fear that the plague would claim her children as it had their father. She watched them closely for any sign of illness, her heart racing at the slightest cough or sniffle. The children, too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation, often begged to go outside and play with their friends. It broke Agnes's heart to have to keep them cooped up inside, but she knew it was for their own protection. One day, as Agnes was preparing a meagre meal of stale bread and thin gruel, she heard a knock at the door. Warily, she cracked it open to find Father John standing outside, his mask firmly in place. He told her that he had come to check on her and the children, and to offer what little comfort he could. Agnes hesitated for a moment, fearful of letting anyone into their home. But the kind look in the priest's eyes reassured her, and she stepped aside to let him enter. Father John sat with the family, offering prayers and words of encouragement. He listened patiently as Agnes poured out her grief and fear, his presence a balm to her troubled soul. When he took his leave, Agnes felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she took strength from the knowledge that she was not alone. As the long, dark days of the plague dragged on, Agnes and her children clung to each other for support. They found small moments of joy where they could, playing quiet games and telling stories by candlelight. Agnes taught her children the importance of cleanliness, making sure they washed their hands and faces regularly. It was a small thing, but it gave her a sense of control in a world that seemed to have gone mad. Slowly, painfully, the village began to recover from the ravages of the Black Death. The sick were tended to as best as possible, and the dead were buried in mass graves outside the village walls. Those who survived emerged from their homes, blinking in the sunlight like moles coming up from their burrows. They grieved for those they had lost, but they also celebrated the fact that they had made it through the worst. For Agnes and her children, life would never be the same. They would always carry the scars of the plague with them, both physical and emotional. But they had each other, and that was enough. As they picked up the pieces of their shattered lives, they did so with a newfound appreciation for the simple joys of each day. A warm meal, a gentle hug, a soft bed to sleep in at night. These were the things that mattered most. As the years passed, the memory of the Black Death began to fade, like a bad dream slowly losing its grip. The village slowly rebuilt itself, stone by stone and family by family. New babies were born, old wounds healed, and life went on. But for those who had lived through the plague, the spectre of illness and death was never far from their thoughts. They knew all too well how fragile life could be, and how quickly it could be snatched away. In a world without modern medicine, where the simplest scratch could turn deadly, they learned to cherish each moment as if it were their last. They told stories of the loved ones they had lost, keeping their memories alive even as their bodies returned to dust. And so, as the sun set over the medieval village, casting long shadows across the fields and lanes, the survivors of the Black Death settled in for another night. They drew their loved ones close, whispered prayers of gratitude and protection, and drifted off to sleep. Their dreams haunted by the ghosts of the past, but their hearts full of hope for the future. For they knew that even in the darkest of times, there was always a glimmer of light to be found. Whether it was the kindness of a neighbor, the love of a family member, or the simple beauty of a sunset, these were the things that made life worth living. And as long as they had each other, they knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead, one day at a time. The story of Agnes and her family is just one of countless tales of resilience and perseverance in the face of unimaginable adversity. Throughout the Middle Ages, people from all walks of life found themselves confronted with the constant threat of disease and death. From the lowliest peasant to the mightiest king, no one was immune to the ravages of illness. One of the most notorious diseases of the medieval period was leprosy. This chronic infectious disease, caused by a bacteria called Mycobacterium leprae, primarily affects the skin, peripheral nerves, upper respiratory tract, and eyes. In medieval times, leprosy was a highly stigmatized condition, with those afflicted often cast out of society and forced to live in isolation. The origins of leprosy are somewhat murky, but it is believed to have first appeared in ancient civilizations like Egypt and China. By the Middle Ages, it had spread throughout Europe, with hundreds of leper colonies established to house the afflicted. These colonies, often located on the outskirts of towns and cities, provided a measure of care and support for those with leprosy, but they also served to keep them separate from the rest of society. One of the most famous leper colonies of the medieval period was the village of Eyam in Derbyshire, England. In 1665, when the Great Plague struck the village, the residents made the brave and selfless decision to quarantine themselves to prevent the spread of the disease to neighbouring towns. For 14 months, the villagers endured unimaginable suffering and loss, with many succumbing to the plague. But their sacrifice paid off, and the plague was contained within the village walls. The story of Eyam is a testament to the strength and resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. It also highlights the importance of community and solidarity in times of crisis. By working together and supporting one another, the villagers of Eyam were able to weather the storm and emerge stronger on the other side. Of course, not everyone was so fortunate when it came to medieval diseases. Many fell victim to the myriad illnesses that plagued the population, from smallpox and tuberculosis to dysentery and influenza. Without access to modern medical treatments, the death toll from these diseases was staggering, with entire families and communities wiped out in a matter of weeks. One of the most tragic examples of this is the case of the bubonic plague, which struck Europe in the 14th century. Also known as the Black Death, this pandemic was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and spread rapidly through flea-infested rats. The symptoms were horrific, with victims developing painful, swollen buboes in their armpits, neck and groin, as well as fever, chills and vomiting. The Black Death claimed the lives of an estimated 75 to 200 million people across Eurasia and North Africa, with some cities and towns losing up to 60% of their population. The impact of the pandemic was felt for generations, with entire regions left devastated and depopulated. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of life in the face of an invisible and deadly enemy. Yet even in the midst of such unimaginable tragedy, there were glimmers of hope and humanity. Doctors and healers worked tirelessly to treat the sick, often at great personal risk to themselves. Religious orders established hospitals and hospices to care for the afflicted, providing comfort and solace in their final moments. And in some cases, as with the village of Eyam, communities banded together to support one another and limit the spread of disease. These stories serve as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit endures. Through compassion, resilience, and solidarity, medieval people found ways to cope with the constant spectre of illness and death. And while we may never fully understand the depths of their suffering, we can honor their memory by learning from their experiences and working to build a world where no one has to face such unimaginable hardship alone. As we reflect on the legacy of medieval diseases, it's worth noting that many of the same challenges that plagued our ancestors continue to confront us today. From the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic to the rise of antibiotic-resistant superbugs, We are still grappling with the threat of infectious disease on a global scale. But we also have tools and knowledge at our disposal that our medieval counterparts could scarcely have imagined. Advances in medical science, from vaccines and antibiotics to cutting-edge diagnostic technologies, have given us a fighting chance against even the most formidable of foes. And while we may still have a long way to go, we can take heart in the progress we've made and the lessons we've learned along the way. One of the most important of those lessons is the value of public health measures in preventing the spread of disease. From basic hygiene practices like hand washing and sanitation, to more complex interventions like quarantine and contact tracing, we now understand the crucial role that such measures play in protecting our communities. We've also come to appreciate the importance of scientific research and collaboration in developing new treatments and therapies. The rapid development of COVID-19 vaccines, for example, is a testament to the power of international cooperation and innovative thinking in the face of a global crisis. Of course, we still face significant challenges when it comes to ensuring equitable access to healthcare and medical resources. Just as in medieval times, marginalized communities often bear the brunt of infectious disease outbreaks, with limited access to testing, treatment, and support services. Addressing these disparities will require a concerted effort from governments, healthcare providers, and civil society organizations alike. But perhaps the most enduring lesson we can take from the history of medieval diseases is the importance of compassion and empathy in the face of suffering. Whether it's a neighbor falling ill with the plague or a loved one battling a chronic condition, we are all connected by our shared vulnerability and our shared humanity. By reaching out to those in need, offering comfort and support where we can, and working together to build a more just and equitable world, we can honor the memory of those who came before us and create a brighter future for generations to come. It's a task that will require courage, perseverance, and no small measure of hope. But if the stories of our medieval ancestors have taught us anything, it's that even in the face of unimaginable odds, the human spirit always finds a way to endure. And so, as we lay our heads down to sleep, let us hold fast to that spirit of resilience and compassion. Let us remember the sacrifices and struggles of those who came before us, and let us draw strength from their example as we face the challenges of our own time. For in the end, it is our shared humanity that will see us through. And it is in that humanity that we will find the hope and healing we so desperately need. The flagellants marched through town, their bare backs bloody and raw from self-inflicted whippings. They believed that by punishing themselves, they could atone for the sins of mankind and persuade God to lift the plague from their lands. As they chanted and flailed, onlookers watched with a mix of reverence and unease. Some even joined in, desperate for any glimmer of hope in these dark times. But not everyone put their faith solely in divine intervention. In the monasteries and convents scattered across Europe, monks and nuns took on the selfless duty of caring for the sick and dying. They offered what meager comfort they could, providing food, clean water, and a kind presence to those suffering from plague and other illnesses. It was a task that many saw as a holy calling, a way to live out their Christian values of charity and compassion. One such caregiver was Sister Maria, a young nun in a small Italian convent near Naples. Though only in her early 20s, Maria had already seen more than her fair share of sickness and death. When the Black Death struck her community, she volunteered to help tend to the afflicted, seeing it as her sacred duty. Day after day, Maria entered the makeshift ward where dozens of plague victims lay suffering. The air was thick with the stench of disease and despair, but she pressed on, offering sips of water to parched lips and whispered prayers to those in their final moments. It was grueling, heartbreaking work, but Maria found strength in her faith and the belief that she was doing God's will. Despite the best efforts of caregivers like Maria, the toll of the plague was devastating, In some regions, it's estimated that up to 60% of the population perished. Whole families were wiped out, leaving behind ghost towns scattered with the unburied dead. It seemed that no matter how much people prayed, repented, or sought remedies, death continued its relentless march across the continent. For many, the sheer scale of the tragedy led to a grim acceptance, a resignation to fate. They saw the plague as a sign of God's wrath, an unstoppable force that could only be endured, not overcome. In a world where life was already fleeting and uncertain, the spectre of disease only added to the sense of helplessness and inevitability. But even in the darkest of times, there were glimmers of hope and progress. While medieval Europe was in the grip of the plague, the Islamic world was making strides in medical knowledge and practice. Scholars and physicians like Ibn Sina, also known as Avicenna, were compiling vast medical encyclopedias that would influence healthcare for centuries to come. Born in 980 AD in what is now Uzbekistan, Ibn Sina was a true polymath, excelling in fields as diverse as philosophy, astronomy, and poetry. But it was his contributions to medicine that would earn him lasting renown. His most famous work, the Canon of Medicine, was a comprehensive guide to medical theory and treatment that drew on both Greco-Roman and Persian traditions. The canon covered a wide range of topics, from anatomy and physiology to disease diagnosis and treatment. It introduced concepts like quarantine to control the spread of illness and emphasized the importance of diet and hygiene in maintaining health. Ibn Sina also pioneered the use of clinical trials to test the effectiveness of treatments, a practice that would become a cornerstone of modern medicine. Although the canon was written in Arabic, it was eventually translated into Latin and other languages, spreading its influence across Europe and beyond. It became a standard text in medical schools and universities, shaping the education of countless physicians for over 600 years. Of course, the impact of works like the canon was gradual and uneven. In medieval Europe, many medical practitioners still clung to ancient and ineffective methods like bloodletting and purging. But there were some who sought to integrate new knowledge and techniques into their practice. One such pioneer was Trotula of Salerno, a female physician who lived and worked in the coastal town of Salerno, Italy, during the 11th or 12th century. Salerno was home to one of the world's first medical schools, and Trotula was one of its most renowned teachers and practitioners. At a time when women were largely excluded from formal medical education, Trotula broke barriers and made significant contributions to the field. She wrote several influential texts on women's health issues, including gynecology, obstetrics, and cosmetics. Her works challenged prevailing notions about female physiology and offered practical advice for treating common ailments. Trotula's legacy extended far beyond her own lifetime. Her texts were widely circulated and translated, influencing medical practice across Europe for centuries. She became a symbol of the potential for women to excel in medicine and science, despite the many obstacles they faced. Stories like those of Ibn Sina and Trotula offer a reminder that even in the bleakest of times, there were individuals working to push the boundaries of knowledge and improve the human condition. Their efforts may have been overshadowed by the immense suffering of the era, but they helped lay the foundation for the medical advances that would come in later centuries. As we return to our plague-stricken village, years after the Black Death first reared its ugly head, we can see small signs of progress and resilience. The streets are a little cleaner, with gutters and rudimentary sanitation systems helping to control the spread of disease. Some of those who survived the initial onslaught have developed a degree of immunity, and they pass on their hard-earned wisdom to the next generation. Life is still hard, and illness still claims far too many lives. But there is a sense of cautious optimism, a belief that by working together and staying vigilant, the worst can be kept at bay. The memories of those lost to the plague are never far from mind, but they serve as a reminder of the preciousness and fragility of life. Looking back from our modern vantage point, it's easy to see how far we've come in the fight against disease. Advances in medical science, technology, and public health have transformed our ability to prevent, diagnose, and treat illness. We have vaccines to protect against once deadly scourges like smallpox and antibiotics to combat infections that used to be a death sentence. Yet we also know that our work is far from finished. New diseases continue to emerge, old ones evolve and resurge, and access to quality healthcare remains uneven across the globe. The COVID-19 pandemic has served as a stark reminder of how vulnerable we still are to the whims of nature and how much we depend on each other for survival and well-being. In that sense, perhaps we are not so different from our medieval ancestors. We may have more knowledge and tools at our disposal, but we still face the same fundamental challenges: how to protect ourselves and our loved ones from harm, how to find meaning and purpose in the face of adversity, and how to build a world that is kinder, safer, and more just for all. As we drift off to sleep, let us hold fast to the lessons of history, the stories of those who came before us, who faced unimaginable hardships and found the strength to carry on. Let us honor their memory by continuing the work of building a better future, one in which no one has to face the terror of illness and death alone. And let us never forget the power of compassion, the importance of caring for one another, even in the darkest of times. For it is in those moments of shared humanity that we find the light that guides us through the storm. So rest now and dream of a world where we all look out for each other, where healing and hope are always within reach. As the barber surgeon made his way through the winding streets of the town, his sharp eyes darted from person to person, searching for signs of illness or injury that might require his services. He was a tall, lean man with a thick beard and a well-worn leather satchel slung over his shoulder. Inside, an array of gleaming blades, saws, and other implements clinked together with each step. The townsfolk eyed him warily as he passed by, some even crossing themselves or muttering prayers under their breath. They knew all too well the pain and suffering that could come at the hands of a man like him. But in times of desperation, when a loved one lay dying of fever or a festering wound, they had little choice but to turn to the barber surgeon. He finally came to a stop outside a small, thatched roof cottage on the outskirts of town. A woman with a haggard face and red-rimmed eyes stood in the doorway, wringing her hands anxiously. "Please, sir," she begged, "my husband. He's been struck down with a terrible ailment. Can you help him?" The barber surgeon simply nodded and followed her inside. The cottage was dark and cramped, with a low ceiling and a dirt floor. In the corner, on a straw mattress, lay the woman's husband. He was ghostly pale, his skin slick with sweat, and his breathing labored. The surgeon set down his satchel and began to examine the man, feeling his forehead for fever and checking his pulse. He frowned as he lifted the man's shirt, revealing a large, swollen lump in his armpit. A bubo, the telltale sign of the dreaded bubonic plague. "I'm afraid it's the pestilence," he said grimly, turning to the wife. "There's not much I can do, but I can try to ease his suffering." He reached into his bag and withdrew a sharp blade and a cup. With deft movements, he lanced the bubo, sending a stream of foul-smelling pus flowing out. The man groaned in agony, but the surgeon paid him no mind. He then placed the cup over the wound and lit a small fire underneath, hoping to draw out the bad humours. As he worked, he recited a prayer to Saint Roch, the patron saint of plague victims. He had seen this terrible illness claim countless lives over the years, and he knew that only divine intervention could truly save a man from its clutches. The wife watched anxiously as the surgeon continued his ministrations, applying poultices of herbs and even a few drops of mercury to the wound. She knew in her heart that it was likely futile, that her beloved husband would soon join the ranks of the dead, but she clung to the faintest glimmer of hope, praying desperately for a miracle. Finally, the surgeon stood up and wiped his bloody hands on a rag. "I've done all I can," he said solemnly. "Now it's in God's hands." He packed up his tools and left a few meager supplies with the wife before taking his leave. As he stepped out into the street, he couldn't help but feel a sense of helplessness wash over him. For all his knowledge and skill, there was still so much about the workings of the human body and the nature of disease that eluded him. He knew he was not alone in this frustration. All across Europe, physicians, apothecaries, and healers of all stripes were grappling with the same challenges. They pored over ancient texts and debated theories of medicine, seeking desperately for some key to unlocking the secrets of health and illness. But for now, the barber surgeon could only continue on his rounds, offering what meager aid and comfort he could to the suffering masses. He sent up a silent prayer for the stricken man and his family, hoping against hope that they might be spared the worst of the pestilence's ravages. As he walked on through the town, he couldn't shake the sense of unease that seemed to hang over everything like a black pall. It was as if the very air itself was tainted with sickness and death. He knew that the plague was far from the only scourge that threatened the lives of the people in these dark times. There were so many other illnesses that constantly stalked the land, striking down young and old alike with brutal efficiency. Dysentery, typhoid fever, smallpox, tuberculosis. Their names were spoken in fearful whispers by those who had seen their loved ones succumb to their terrible grip. The barber surgeon had witnessed it all firsthand, the retching and bleeding of dysentery victims, their bodies wasted away to mere skeletons, the high, raging fevers and delirium of those stricken with typhoid, the oozing, pustulent sores that covered the faces of smallpox sufferers, the racking coughs and bloody sputum of consumptives slowly drowning in their own lungs. It seemed at times as if the very fabric of society was being unraveled by the relentless onslaught of these diseases. Families were torn apart, whole villages decimated, the ranks of the dead swelling with each passing day. And yet, life went on, as it always had. The fields still needed to be tilled, the livestock tended, the daily rituals of existence carried out even in the face of such overwhelming sorrow and loss. The people clung to their faith, to the small moments of joy and love that sustained them through the darkest of times. As the barber surgeon made his way back to his humble abode on the edge of town, he couldn't help but reflect on the strange duality of his profession. He was both revered and reviled by the common folk, seen as a bearer of both healing and suffering. In truth, he knew that the remedies and treatments he offered were often little more than guesswork and superstition, passed down from master to apprentice over the generations. The humoral theory that guided so much of medieval medicine, with its emphasis on balancing the body's 4 vital fluids, seemed increasingly inadequate in the face of the complex realities of disease. And yet, he also knew that his role went far beyond the mere physical ministrations he provided. In a world where life was so precarious, so fraught with uncertainty and danger, he served as a beacon of hope and comfort to those in despair. He thought of all the hands he had held as they slipped from this mortal coil, all the brows he had soothed with cool cloths and gentle words, all the prayers he had whispered over the dying in their final moments. It was a heavy burden to bear, but one he shouldered willingly. For in the end, what else could he do but offer what little solace and succor he could to his fellow man in their time of greatest need? In a world so full of darkness and suffering, it was the smallest acts of kindness and compassion that shone the brightest. As he reached his doorstep and stepped inside, the barber surgeon sent up one final prayer for the souls of all those who had fallen victim to the merciless ravages of disease. "May they find peace in the hereafter," he whispered, "and may those left behind find the strength to carry on in their absence." And with that, he closed his eyes and let the weariness of the day wash over him, knowing that tomorrow would bring fresh challenges and fresh sorrows, but also, perhaps, the faintest glimmer of hope amidst the gathering gloom. As the barber surgeon made his way through the winding streets of the town, his reputation preceded him. Whispers followed in his wake. Some sang his praises as a skilled healer, while others murmured darkly of patients who had met grisly fates under his knife. The truth, as ever, likely lay somewhere in between. He cut an imposing figure as he strode into the market square, his leather apron stained with the telltale signs of his trade. At his side hung an array of gleaming blades, saws, and other implements, whose purposes were best left to the imagination. The locals eyed him warily, unsure whether to approach or keep their distance. But approach they did, for what choice did they have? In a world where even a simple cut could fester and lead to a slow, agonizing demise, the services of a barber surgeon were always in high demand. And so, a queue began to form, the townsfolk lining up to place their lives and well-being in the hands of this enigmatic figure. One by one, they stepped forward to present their ailments and injuries. A farmer, his hand mangled by a plough blade. A young mother, desperate to save her feverish child. An elderly man, his skin mottled with weeping sores. The barber surgeon listened to each in turn, his expression inscrutable behind his bushy beard. For some, he prescribed poultices and tinctures, concocted from herbs and ingredients that only he seemed to know. For others, he recommended more drastic measures, a bloodletting to balance the humours, or perhaps the application of leeches to draw out bad blood. And for an unfortunate few, he grimly suggested surgery, an amputation to prevent the spread of gangrene, or the agonising process of trepanning to relieve pressure on the brain. Throughout it all, the question lingered. Were these treatments truly effective, or were they simply the desperate grasping of a society still in the dark about the true causes of illness and disease? It was a question that even the most learned medical minds of the age struggled to answer. For in truth, the medieval understanding of the human body and how it functioned was woefully inadequate. Physicians and healers alike were guided by ancient theories and superstitions that, while occasionally containing kernels of wisdom, were just as often wildly off the mark. Chief among these was the concept of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, which were thought to govern health and personality. An imbalance of these humours was believed to be the root cause of most ailments, and treatments were designed to restore equilibrium through whatever means necessary. This often led to practices that, to modern eyes, seem misguided at best and downright barbaric at worst. Bloodletting, for instance, was an immensely popular practice predicated on the belief that draining away excess, or bad blood, could cure a vast array of ills. In reality, it only served to weaken already frail patients, and in some cases likely hastened their demise. Similarly, the use of leeches and other parasites to draw out corrupt humours was widespread, despite there being little to no evidence of their efficacy. More exotic treatments abounded as well: the application of hot plasters made from dung or rotting meat, the consumption of powdered mummies or unicorn horns, even the use of charms and amulets to ward off evil spirits believed to cause disease. Perhaps most terrifying of all was the practice of trepanation, the drilling or scraping of holes in the skull to treat everything from headaches to epilepsy to mental disorders. While some patients miraculously survived the ordeal, many surely succumbed to infection or trauma in the days and weeks after the grisly operation. Through it all, the spectre of death loomed large. In a world without antibiotics, even minor wounds and illnesses could quickly turn fatal if left untreated or exacerbated by well-meaning but misguided attempts at healing. Childbirth, too, was an immensely perilous undertaking, it's estimated that as many as 1 in 3 women may have died as a result of complications during labor. And then there were the great pandemics that periodically swept through medieval societies, claiming countless lives and sowing terror in their wake. Foremost among these was the Black Death, which raged across Europe in the 14th century and wiped out an estimated 30 to 60% of the population in the span of just a few years. The cause of the plague was unknown to medieval physicians, who attributed it variously to poisoned air, divine retribution, or even the alignment of the planets. Treatments ranged from the ineffectual, such as the burning of aromatic herbs or the wearing of magical amulets, to the downright bizarre. One 14th century doctor recommended a concoction of ground-up snakes, pigeon's blood, and chunks of treacle to ward off the pestilence. In the end, of course, such measures did little to stem the tide of death and suffering. Entire villages were decimated, their inhabitants succumbing one by one until only ghosts and memories remained. The social and economic repercussions of the plague were immense and far-reaching, reshaping the very fabric of medieval life in ways that would reverberate for generations to come. Yet even in the darkest of times, there were glimmers of hope and progress. In the Islamic world, scholars and physicians were making great strides in the understanding of anatomy, physiology, and disease. Figures like Ibn Sina, also known as Avicenna, compiled vast medical encyclopedias that would serve as the standard texts for centuries to come. In Europe, too, there were signs of a gradual shift towards a more empirical, evidence-based approach to medicine. The establishment of early hospitals and medical schools, such as the famed Schola Medica Salernitana in Italy, provided a forum for the dissemination of knowledge and the training of a new generation of practitioners. And in the realm of public health, some forward-thinking cities began to take steps to improve sanitation and hygiene, recognizing the link between filth and disease. The construction of sewers and public latrines, the paving of streets, and the regulation of food markets all helped to reduce the spread of contagion, even if the underlying causes remained a mystery. But these were small steps on a long and arduous journey. For the vast majority of people in medieval times, life remained a precarious proposition, forever at the mercy of famine, war, and pestilence. The idea of a world without the constant spectre of death and suffering was almost impossible to imagine. And yet, slowly but surely, that world was coming into being. With each passing year, each new discovery and innovation, the darkness of superstition and ignorance was gradually giving way to the light of reason and science. It would be a long and difficult road, with many setbacks and reversals along the way, but the destination was clear. For the barber surgeon making his rounds in that nameless medieval town, of course, such lofty thoughts were likely far from his mind. His was a world of blood and pus, of screaming patients and harrowing choices, of life and death balanced on the edge of a knife. But in his own way, he too was part of that great human struggle towards understanding, towards mastery over the unseen forces that governed our frail mortal coils. Through trial and error, through the hard-won knowledge passed down from generation to generation, he and his ilk were laying the foundations for the medical miracles of the future. And so he soldiered on, applying his poultices and wielding his blades, doing what little he could to ease the suffering of his fellow man. It was a grim and thankless task, but one that someone had to undertake. For in the face of the great unknown, the unyielding cruelty of the cosmos, what choice did any of us have but to reach out into the darkness, to comfort and to heal, to rage against the dying of the light? These were the thoughts that flickered through the barber surgeon's mind as he made his way back to his humble abode that evening, his apron heavy with the weariness of the day's labours. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, more pain, more fear, more desperate battles against the ravages of disease and decay. But for now, he could rest, secure in the knowledge that he had done his part to push back against the tide of human suffering. And in the end, perhaps that was all any of us could hope for: to leave the world a little better than we found it, to plant the seeds of a brighter future that we ourselves might never live to see. It was a small and fragile hope, but one that burned bright in the hearts of the healers and the dreamers, the seekers and the sages, who dared to imagine a world beyond the shadow of death. So let us raise a glass to those unsung heroes of the medieval age, those barber surgeons and wise women, those alchemists and apothecaries, who toiled in the face of unimaginable odds to keep the flame of hope alive. Theirs was a legacy written in blood and sweat, in the anguished cries of the sick and the dying. But it was a legacy that echoed down through the centuries, paving the way for the marvels of modern medicine that we so often take for granted. And let us never forget the hard-won lessons of those dark and desperate times, the grim reminders of our own fragility and the preciousness of life. For in the end, we are all of us heirs to that great human struggle, that timeless quest to push back against the boundaries of our own mortality, to wrest meaning and purpose from the jaws of oblivion. It is a struggle that continues to this day, in the gleaming halls of hospitals and research labs, in the quiet determination of doctors and nurses, in the indomitable spirit of patients and their loved ones. And though the road ahead may be long and fraught with peril, we can take solace in the knowledge that we do not walk it alone, that we are part of a great and noble lineage, stretching back to the very dawn of civilization. So let us press on, armed with the hard-won wisdom of the ages, guided by the light of reason and compassion, ever striving towards that shining city on the hill, that world where the spectre of death and suffering holds no sway, where every child born has the chance to live a life of dignity and purpose, free from the ravages of disease and despair. It is a world that may always hover just out of reach, a dream that may never be fully realized. But it is a dream worth fighting for, a dream worth living for, a dream that has sustained our species through the darkest of nights and the coldest of winters. And so we carry on, you and I, the living and the dead, the dreamers and the healers, the barber surgeons and the plague doctors, all of us bound together by that great and terrible beauty that is the human condition. May we never lose sight of that beauty, even in the midst of darkness and despair. May we never cease to strive for that better world, that kinder world, that world where love and light reign supreme. For in the end, that is all we have, the love we share, the light we kindle, the dreams we dare to dream. It is a fragile and fleeting thing, this gift of life, but it is ours to cherish and to hold, to nurture and to defend. And so let us go forth, you and I, into that great unknown, armed with the courage of our convictions and the strength of our compassion. Let us rage against the dying of the light, now and always, for as long as there is breath in our bodies and hope in our hearts. Let us remember the barber surgeon and his kind, those brave and broken souls who came before us, who fought the good fight even in the face of overwhelming odds. And let us honor their memory by picking up where they left off, by taking up the mantle of healing and hope, by daring to dream of a world beyond the shadow of death. It is a long and winding road that stretches out before us, a road paved with tears and laughter, with sorrow and joy, with pain and beauty beyond measure. But it is our road to walk, our story to tell, our legacy to leave. So let us walk it together, hand in hand, heart to heart, now and always, even unto the ends of the earth. For in the end, that is all we can do, to stand together against the darkness, to reach out into the unknown, to light a candle in the window of the world and dare to dream of brighter days to come. As the barber surgeon continued his journey from town to town, he carried with him a variety of instruments and techniques that were commonplace in medieval medicine. His toolkit included razors for bloodletting, leeches for drawing out bad humours, and even crude drills for trepanning. The practice of boring holes into the skull to relieve pressure or release evil spirits. While these treatments may seem barbaric or misguided to us today, they were widely accepted and even respected in the Middle Ages. The prevailing belief was that illness resulted from an imbalance of the 4 bodily fluids, or humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Bleeding a patient, sometimes excessively, was thought to restore this delicate balance and promote healing. The barber surgeon, though often untrained and illiterate, held a position of some esteem in medieval society. In addition to performing medical procedures, he also took on the roles of dentist, embalmer, and even barber, hence the title. However, the lack of formal education and reliance on tradition rather than science meant that these medical practitioners often did more harm than good. Take, for example, the story of a young woman suffering from a high fever and severe abdominal pain. The local barber surgeon was called to her bedside, where he promptly diagnosed an excess of black bile. He proceeded to slice open a vein and drain copious amounts of blood, leaving the patient weak and delirious. When her condition failed to improve, he resorted to applying hot poultices to her stomach, which only served to intensify her agony. Sadly, this woman's tale was not uncommon in the Middle Ages. Many patients suffered needlessly at the hands of well-intentioned but misguided healers who lacked a true understanding of the human body and the causes of disease. Some even met their untimely demise as a direct result of the treatments inflicted upon them. It's important to note, however, that not all medical care in the medieval period was provided by barber surgeons. Monasteries often served as centres of healing, with monks and nuns tending to the sick and infirm as part of their religious duties. These monastic infirmaries offered a place of rest and comfort for the afflicted, even if the treatments they provided were not much more effective than those of the barber surgeons. Apothecaries, too, played a role in medieval healthcare. These early pharmacists compounded herbal remedies and dispensed them to patients, often working in conjunction with physicians. While some of the herbs used, like fennel and mint, did have genuine medicinal properties, others were based on superstition or folklore. Mandrake root, for instance, was believed to cure everything from impotence to demonic possession, despite being highly toxic. One of the most enduring and misguided beliefs in medieval medicine was the miasma theory, which held that disease was spread by foul-smelling air. This led to practices like carrying sweet-smelling posies or wearing elaborate beak-like masks filled with aromatic herbs to ward off the bad air. While these measures did little to prevent the spread of illness, they were widely adopted during times of plague and pestilence. As the barber surgeon packed up his tools and prepared to move on to the next town, he couldn't help but reflect on the limitations of his craft. Despite his best efforts, he knew that many of his patients would not survive their illnesses. It was a sobering reality of life in the Middle Ages, where death was always close at hand. But even in the face of such grim prospects, the barber surgeon and his contemporaries soldiered on, doing what they could to ease suffering and prolong life. They may have been misguided in their methods, but their intentions were often pure. And in a time when the mysteries of the human body were still largely unknown, they represented the best hope for those struck down by disease and injury. As we look back on the medical practices of the Middle Ages from our modern vantage point, it's easy to dismiss them as primitive or even barbaric. But it's important to remember that these healers were working with the knowledge and tools available to them at the time. They may have been wrong in many of their assumptions, but they were also pioneers, paving the way for the eventual emergence of evidence-based medicine. In the centuries that followed, Advances in anatomy, physiology, and microbiology would revolutionize our understanding of health and disease. But the seeds of that progress were sown in the work of medieval healers who toiled tirelessly in the face of immense challenges and often at great personal risk. So as we continue our journey through the annals of medieval history, let us remember the barber surgeons, the apothecaries, and the monastic healers who came before us. They may not have had all the answers, but they asked the right questions and set us on the path to greater understanding. And for that, we owe them a debt of gratitude. The road ahead was long and fraught with peril, as endemic diseases continued to take their toll on medieval populations. From the cramped and filthy cities to the war-torn battlefields, sickness and death were constant companions, striking down rich and poor alike. Dysentery, a painful and often fatal infection of the digestive system, was rampant in the unsanitary conditions of the time. Caused by contaminated food or water, it could quickly spread through entire communities, leaving a wake of suffering and loss in its path. The telltale symptoms, severe abdominal cramps, fever, and bloody diarrhea, were a source of dread for medieval families. Typhoid fever, another waterborne illness, was equally devastating. Transmitted by the feces of infected individuals, it could lay waste to entire households in a matter of days. The high fever, rash, and delirium it produced were a source of great anguish for those who watched their loved ones succumb to its ravages. Smallpox, a highly contagious viral disease, was one of the most feared scourges of the Middle Ages. Its victims were left covered in painful, oozing blisters that often led to permanent scarring or blindness. In an era before vaccination, it claimed countless lives and left entire villages reeling in its wake. Tuberculosis, a bacterial infection that primarily affects the lungs, was another endemic killer. Its slow, wasting course could drag on for years, leaving sufferers emaciated and coughing up blood. In the close quarters of medieval households, it could easily spread from person to person, decimating entire families. The impact of these diseases was felt at every level of society, from the lowliest peasant to the highest king. Armies were weakened by dysentery and typhoid, leaving them vulnerable to defeat on the battlefield. Kingdoms were left reeling by the loss of key leaders and the economic devastation wrought by widespread illness. But perhaps the greatest toll was exacted on the common folk, whose daily lives were a constant struggle against disease and deprivation. For them, the threat of illness was compounded by chronic malnutrition and the ever-present spectre of famine. When crops failed or wars disrupted food supplies, the weakened populace was left even more vulnerable to the ravages of endemic diseases. It was a vicious cycle that played out again and again in medieval Europe. A bad harvest could lead to widespread hunger, which in turn could weaken the immune systems of entire communities. This left them more susceptible to diseases like tuberculosis and smallpox, which could then spread like wildfire through the malnourished population. The result was a cascade of suffering and death that could take years to recover from. For the average medieval family, this meant living in a constant state of anxiety and grief. They might lose a child to dysentery one year, a parent to tuberculosis the next. The spectre of disease was always lurking, ready to strike down the young and old alike. And in a world without modern medicine or social safety nets, the loss of a breadwinner could spell ruin for an entire household. Yet even in the face of such unrelenting tragedy, medieval communities found ways to carry on. They banded together in times of crisis, sharing what meager resources they had and tending to the sick and dying as best they could. They sought solace in their faith, praying for deliverance from the scourges that afflicted them. And slowly, painfully, they began to develop the knowledge and practices that would eventually lead to better health and longer lives. From the Islamic world came advances in hygiene and sanitation, as well as a greater emphasis on empirical observation and experimentation. In Europe, the rise of universities and the rediscovery of ancient medical texts laid the foundation for a more scientific approach to healing. But progress was slow and uneven, and for the vast majority of medieval people, life remained nasty, brutish, and short. They lived and died at the mercy of forces beyond their control, from the microscopic pathogens that ravaged their bodies to the social and economic systems that kept them mired in poverty and squalor. As we look back on this grim chapter in human history, it's easy to feel a sense of hopelessness and despair. But we must also remember the incredible resilience and tenacity of the human spirit, which allowed medieval people to endure unimaginable hardships and keep going in the face of overwhelming odds. Their story is one of struggle and survival, of loss and renewal. And while we may now live in a world of antibiotics and vaccines, we are still not immune to the forces of disease and death. We would do well to learn from the lessons of our medieval ancestors, who faced the spectre of illness with courage, compassion, and an unshakable will to persevere. In our modern age, with all its technological marvels and medical breakthroughs, it's easy to forget just how far we've come. We take for granted the antibiotics that can cure a life-threatening infection with a few pills, the vaccines that have eradicated smallpox and polio, the sanitation systems that keep our water clean and our cities livable. But for the people of medieval Europe, these were unimaginable luxuries. They lived in a world where even a minor cut could lead to a deadly case of sepsis, where childbirth was a harrowing ordeal that claimed the lives of countless mothers and infants, where a simple bout of diarrhea could spell the end for a frail or elderly person. In the face of such overwhelming odds, they turned to the only sources of comfort and hope available to them: their faith and their community. Religion played a central role in medieval life, offering not only spiritual solace, but also practical aid in times of crisis. Monasteries and convents served as hospitals and hospices, providing care for the sick and dying when no one else would. Pilgrimage sites like the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury, or the relics of the True Cross in Jerusalem, drew throngs of desperate supplicants, each hoping for a miraculous cure or divine intervention. The power of prayer and faith healing may seem like mere superstition to modern minds, but for medieval people, they were a vital lifeline in a world where medicine had little to offer. Yet even the most devout could not escape the grim realities of life in the Middle Ages. When the Black Death struck in the 14th century, claiming up to half the population of Europe, many saw it as a punishment from God for the sins of humanity. Some resorted to extreme acts of penance, like the flagellants who roamed the countryside, whipping themselves into a bloody frenzy as a way to atone for their transgressions. Others sought scapegoats for the calamity, lashing out at marginalized groups like Jews and lepers, who were often blamed for spreading disease. The persecution of witches, which reached its peak in the early modern period, had its roots in the fear and superstition of the Middle Ages, when any misfortune could be attributed to the work of malevolent spells and demonic influence. Against this backdrop of religious fervor and existential dread, there were some glimmers of hope and progress. The Islamic world, with its advanced system of hospitals and emphasis on empirical observation, made significant strides in medical knowledge during the Middle Ages. Scholars like Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, and Al-Razi, Rhazes, made groundbreaking contributions to the understanding of anatomy, physiology, and disease. In Europe, the establishment of medical schools like the one in Salerno, Italy, marked a tentative step towards a more scientific approach to healing. Here, students learned not only from ancient texts, but also from hands-on experience with patients, dissecting cadavers to gain a better understanding of the human body. Yet even these early pioneers were limited by the prevailing beliefs and superstitions of their time. The theory of the four humours, which held that health was a balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, remained dominant throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. Treatments like bloodletting and purging were still widely practiced, even as some began to question their efficacy. Herbal remedies, too, were a mainstay of medieval medicine, with monks and nuns cultivating extensive gardens of medicinal plants. Some of these, like foxglove, used to treat heart conditions, and willow bark, a natural source of aspirin, have since been validated by modern science. Others, like the belief in the healing power of unicorn horns and powdered mummies, have been consigned to the dustbin of history. As we sift through the medical lore of the Middle Ages, it's tempting to dismiss it all as mere quackery and superstition. But to do so would be to ignore the very real suffering and courage of the people who lived and died in that time. They may not have had the knowledge or tools we have today, but they faced the spectre of illness and death with a fortitude and resilience that is truly humbling. In their stories, we can find echoes of our own struggles and triumphs. We may no longer fear the Black Death or rely on leeches and bloodletting, but we still grapple with the challenges of disease, the limits of our knowledge, and the ever-present reality of our own mortality. As we look to the future of medicine, with its promise of gene therapies and personalized treatments, we would do well to remember the hard-won lessons of the past. We stand on the shoulders of giants, from the barber surgeons and apothecaries of the Middle Ages to the scientists and physicians of today. Their legacy is one of perseverance in the face of adversity, of hope in the darkest of times. It is a reminder that even in the midst of suffering and loss, the human spirit endures, ever seeking new ways to heal, to comfort, and to carry on. So let us honor the memory of those who came before us, and let us strive to build upon their work with compassion, humility, and an unwavering commitment to the alleviation of human suffering. For in the end, that is the true measure of our progress as a species, and the ultimate goal of all our endeavors. As we come to the end of our journey through the annals of medieval medicine, we find ourselves back in the village where we began, years after the devastation of the Black Death. The once bustling streets are quieter now, the faces of the survivors etched with the lines of grief and hardship. But there are also signs of hope and renewal. The local lord, having lost his own family to the plague, has ordered the construction of a new well and a system of gutters to carry away waste and rainwater. The monks at the nearby abbey have taken to burning aromatic herbs in the streets, hoping to purify the air and ward off miasmas. In the marketplace, a new apothecary has set up shop, offering an array of tonics and tinctures made from exotic spices and locally grown herbs. He claims to have studied with the great Ibn Sina himself, and his remedies are said to have saved many lives during the recent outbreak of dysentery. The barber surgeon, too, has adapted to the changing times. He now boasts a collection of finely crafted surgical instruments, imported from the great cities of Italy and the Islamic world. He has even taken on an apprentice, a bright young man with a keen eye and a steady hand. These may seem like small changes in the grand scheme of things, but they represent a glimmer of progress in a world that has known so much darkness. They are a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit, which refuses to be beaten down by even the greatest of adversities. As we take our leave of this medieval village, we can't help but reflect on how far we've come since those grim and uncertain times. We live in an age of antibiotics and anesthesia, of organ transplants and stem cell therapies. We have eradicated smallpox and polio, and we are on the cusp of defeating malaria and HIV. But we also know that our work is far from finished. New diseases emerge every year, from SARS and Ebola to COVID-19 and whatever comes next. Drug-resistant superbugs threaten to undo a century of progress, while climate change and environmental degradation pose existential threats to human health and well-being. In the face of these challenges, we must summon the same courage and determination that saw our medieval ancestors through their darkest hours. We must be willing to question old assumptions, to embrace new ideas, and to work tirelessly in the pursuit of knowledge and understanding. Above all, we must remember that medicine is more than just a science or a profession. It is a calling, a sacred trust that binds us to our fellow human beings in their moments of greatest need. It is a reminder that we are all in this together, that our fates are intertwined, and that none of us is truly healthy until all of us are. So let us go forth from this place with renewed purpose and compassion. Let us honor the memory of those who suffered and died in the centuries before us, and let us work to build a world where no one must endure such suffering again. For in the end, that is the true legacy of medieval medicine, and indeed of all human. As the barber surgeon made his way into town, his cart laden with an array of sharp blades, metallic tools, and mysterious tinctures, a sense of both hope and unease rippled through the sickly community. In an age where medical knowledge was often intertwined with superstition and religious beliefs, these traveling healers were seen as both saviors and harbingers of suffering. The townsfolk gathered around, desperate for any glimmer of relief from the relentless onslaught of disease. A frail, elderly man hobbled forward, his body racked with a persistent, hacking cough that spoke of a deep-seated illness within. With a grave nod, the barber surgeon gestured for the man to sit upon a wooden stool. He reached for a crude lancet, its edge gleaming in the sunlight, and with a swift, practiced motion, made a deep incision into the man's arm. The patient gritted his teeth, his face contorted in a mix of pain and desperate hope as dark, thick blood began to flow into a waiting bowl. Bloodletting, a staple of medieval medicine, was believed to restore balance to the body's four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. An excess or deficiency in any of these was thought to be the root cause of illness and disease. By draining excess or bad blood, practitioners hoped to restore equilibrium and promote healing. Yet, as we now know, this practice often did more harm than good, weakening already frail bodies and sometimes introducing new infections through unsanitary tools. The barber surgeon moved from patient to patient, his techniques varying but equally misguided. For a young boy suffering from a severe headache, he recommended trepanation, the drilling of a hole into the skull to release evil spirits believed to be the source of the pain. The child's mother watched in a mix of apprehension and desperate faith as the barber surgeon bore into her son's head with a crude hand drill, praying silently that this would bring relief. An elderly woman, her skin pocked with the telltale scars of smallpox, was prescribed a poultice of bread mold and vinegar to draw out the poisons. Though we now understand that certain molds contain antibiotic properties, the haphazard application and lack of understanding often rendered such treatments ineffective at best. As the day wore on, the barber surgeon's cart slowly emptied of its gruesome array of bloodied bowls and soiled rags. The town square buzzed with a mix of excitement and fear, some claiming to feel invigorated by their treatments, others already feeling the onset of new fevers and infections. In the coming days, some would recover, their resilient bodies fighting off illness despite the dubious interventions. Others would succumb, their weakened states exacerbated by the very treatments meant to heal them. Such was the precarious nature of life and death in the face of medieval medicine. As night fell, the barber surgeon packed up his wares and prepared to move on to the next town, leaving behind a trail of blood, hope, and sorrow. For the villagers, the spectre of illness remained an ever-present threat, their faith in God and the promise of relief through suffering their only solace in a world where the true causes of disease remained shrouded in mystery. Amidst the patchwork fields and dense primeval forests, another town came into view, its thatched roofs and dirt paths so similar to those just left behind. Here too, the familiar telltale signs of endemic diseases were etched upon the faces of the weary inhabitants. A young mother cradled her feverish child, the little one's face flushed and slick with sweat. The woman's own eyes were hollowed by exhaustion and grief, having already lost 2 children to the relentless grip of dysentery the previous summer. The child's belly was swollen and distended, racked with cramps, as the infection ravaged their small body. Nearby, an elderly man sat slumped against the wall of his small hovel, his breath rattling in his chest with each labored inhalation. The telltale bloody cough and wasting frame spoke to the consumption that had claimed so many lives, the disease we now know as tuberculosis. In the fields beyond, a group of labourers toiled under the hot sun, their bodies thin and weakened by the constant spectre of malnutrition. The meagre harvests and periodic famines left them vulnerable to the onslaught of illnesses, their immune systems compromised by the lack of nourishment. The people of this town, like so many others across the medieval world, lived in the constant shadow of death and disease. The names and faces might change from village to village, but the stories remained hauntingly similar. Lives cut short, families torn asunder, and communities struggling to carry on in the face of unrelenting tragedy. For the wealthy and powerful, there was some small measure of respite. Castles and fortified manors offered a degree of separation from the squalor and filth of the common folk, their inhabitants benefiting from slightly better nutrition and living conditions. Yet even they were not immune to the ravages of illness, as the periodomniprof, dysentery and disease among the royal courts of Europe could attest. In the monasteries and convents that dotted the landscape, a different kind of battle against illness was being waged. Here, the sick and dying were often tended to by monks and nuns, who saw it as their holy duty to offer comfort and care to the afflicted. The infirmaries of these religious institutions were often the closest thing to a hospital that many people would ever know. Herbal remedies and careful nursing provided some small measure of relief, even if the underlying causes of disease remained a mystery. Yet even within the cloistered walls of the monastery, the spectre of illness and death was never far away. Many a young novice fell victim to the same diseases that ravaged the outside world, their lives cut short before they could take their final vows. As the barber surgeon made his way into this new town, setting up his temporary stall in the market square, the cycle of hope and despair began anew. The people here, like those in countless other villages, were desperate for any glimmer of relief, any chance to stave off the grim reaper for a little while longer. And so they came, the sick and the suffering, the young and the old, placing their trust in the crude tools and unproven remedies of the travelling healer. Some would find a temporary respite from their ailments, their faith in the power of medicine bolstered for a time. Others, weakened by the very treatments meant to save them, would succumb to the ravages of infection and disease, their bodies added to the growing toll of medieval life. It was a never-ending dance of life and death, played out against the backdrop of a world still shrouded in the mysteries of the human body and the forces that sought to destroy it. As the barber surgeon packed up his cart once more, ready to move on to the next town, the cycle of hope and despair continued unabated. For the people of this village, as for so many others, the fight against illness and disease was a constant companion, a battle that would be waged for generations to come. The road stretched out ahead, a ribbon of dust and dirt winding its way through the lush green countryside. The barber surgeon urged his horse forward, the cart creaking and swaying with the weight of his tools and remedies. In the distance, the spires of a grand cathedral pierced the sky, a testament to the faith and devotion of the people who lived and died in its shadow. For many, The promise of salvation in the afterlife was the only comfort in a world so often filled with pain and suffering. As he approached the outskirts of the next town, the barber surgeon could already see the familiar signs of illness and disease. A group of peasants, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow, huddled around a small fire, seeking warmth and solace in the face of their afflictions. An old woman, her skin mottled with the telltale rash of typhoid fever, lay shivering on a bed of straw. Her family gathered around her in a vigil of prayer and helplessness. A young boy, his body racked with the convulsions of epilepsy, thrashed and moaned as his mother tried in vain to soothe him. These were the sights and sounds of medieval life, a world where the spectre of illness and death was never far away. For the people of this time, the promise of relief through prayer and pilgrimage, through holy relics and sacred rituals, was often the only hope they had. The barber surgeon set up his stall in the town square, his arrival greeted with a mix of hope and apprehension. The people here, like those in so many other places, were desperate for any chance at respite from their suffering, any glimmer of hope in a world so often filled with darkness. As the first patient took their place on the wooden bench, the barber surgeon reached for his tools, his mind already racing with the possible diagnoses and treatments. Was it an excess of black bile that needed to be purged? A demonic possession that required the application of holy water and prayer? He would do his best, applying the knowledge and skill passed down through generations of healers, even as the true causes of illness remained shrouded in mystery. In a world where the secrets of the human body were still locked away, where the microscopic agents of disease were yet unknown, he could only hope that his efforts would bring some small measure of relief to those who suffered. As the day wore on, and the patients came and went, the barber surgeon could not help but feel a sense of helplessness in the face of so much pain and suffering. For every life he saved, every ailment he managed to alleviate, there were countless others who slipped away, their bodies ravaged by forces beyond his understanding or control. Yet still, he persevered, driven by a sense of duty and a belief in the power of healing, no matter how limited or misguided it might be. In a world where life was so often cut short, where the spectre of death lurked around every corner, he would do what he could to ease the suffering of those who crossed his path. As the sun began to set over the medieval town, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets and thatched roofs, the barber surgeon packed up his tools and prepared to move on once more. The road ahead was long and uncertain, the challenges he would face as daunting as ever. But for now, he could take solace in the knowledge that he had made a difference, however small, in the lives of those he had treated. In a world so often filled with darkness and despair, that glimmer of hope and humanity was a precious thing indeed. As he drove his cart out of town, the barber surgeon could not help but reflect on the state of medicine in his time. The theories and practices that guided his work, handed down through generations of healers, seemed so inadequate in the face of the vast array of diseases and afflictions that plagued the people of the medieval world. The miasma theory, which held that disease was caused by foul-smelling air, still held sway among many practitioners. The belief that the alignment of the stars and planets could influence health and well-being was also widespread, leading some to seek the advice of astrologers and soothsayers in times of illness. Even the role of apothecaries, with their vast arrays of herbs, tinctures, and potions, was often more steeped in superstition than in any real understanding of the human body and its workings. The use of charms, amulets, and other mystical objects was commonplace, as people sought any means to ward off the ever-present threat of disease and death. And yet, amidst all the ignorance and misunderstanding, there were glimmers of progress and enlightenment. In the Islamic world, scholars like Ibn Sina were making great strides in the study of medicine, laying the foundations for a more scientific approach to healing. The establishment of medical schools, like the one in Salerno, Italy, was also a step in the right direction, providing a more formalized system of education and training for for aspiring healers. The works of ancient physicians like Galen and Hippocrates were being rediscovered and studied anew, offering insights into the workings of the human body that had been lost for centuries. But for the barber surgeon, and for the vast majority of people living in the medieval world, these advances were still a long way off. The reality of their lives was one of constant struggle against the ravages of disease, of desperate hopes pinned on the skills of traveling healers and the power of prayer. As he made his way down the winding road, the barber surgeon could only hope that his efforts, however small and imperfect, were making a difference, that the knowledge and skill he passed on to his apprentices would one day help to build a better, healthier world for all. The journey ahead was long and uncertain, the challenges many and daunting. But with each village visited, each patient treated, the barber surgeon knew that he was playing his part in the great tapestry of human history. A history marked by suffering and sorrow, yes, but also by hope, resilience, and the unquenchable desire to heal and be healed. And so, he pressed on, his cart creaking and swaying beneath the weight of his tools and remedies, his heart heavy with the burdens of his calling. The road stretched out before him, a ribbon of dust and promise, leading ever onward into the unknown. In a small German village, a glimmer of hope was starting to take hold, amidst the ubiquitous misery of disease. The village elders had begun to implement some rudimentary public health measures, having observed that filth and poor sanitation seemed to breed illness. Crude gutters were dug to channel waste away from the living quarters, and villagers were encouraged to keep their animals separate from their homes. The local monastery had also begun to emphasize the importance of hand washing and cleanliness among the brothers, a practice that slowly started to spread to the lay community. These measures, though simple and limited, marked a critical shift in thinking. Rather than solely relying on divine intervention or the mystical cures of traveling healers, the people of this village were starting to take practical steps to prevent the spread of disease. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, a tiny spark of light in the vast darkness of medieval ignorance and superstition. But it was a start, a foundation upon which future generations would slowly build. As the years passed and the barber surgeon continued his travels, he began to notice subtle changes in the villages he visited. More and more, he encountered communities that were starting to embrace basic hygiene and sanitation, their streets a little cleaner, their air a little less foul. It was a slow and halting progress, often met with resistance and skepticism from those who clung to the old ways. But it was progress nonetheless, a sign that the long and arduous journey towards a healthier, more enlightened world was finally beginning. For the barber surgeon himself, these changes brought a sense of both hope and melancholy. He could see the promise of a better future, a world where the scourge of disease might one day be tamed by the power of knowledge and reason, but he also knew that he would not live to see that future himself. His own journey was nearing its end, his body weakened by the many trials and hardships of his long and difficult life. As he looked back on his years of service, the countless lives he had touched, the suffering he had witnessed and tried to alleviate, he could not help but feel a sense of both pride and humility. He had done his best, given all that he had to the cause of healing, even in the face of overwhelming ignorance and despair. And now, as he prepared to pass on his knowledge and his tools to a new generation of healers, he could only hope that they would carry on his work, building upon the small but vital foundation he and others like him had laid. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, the challenges many and daunting. But with each passing year, each small victory against the darkness of disease, the world was slowly but surely moving towards a brighter, healthier future. And so, the barber surgeon, his journey at an end, could rest easy in the knowledge that he had played his part, however small, in the great and ongoing struggle for life and health in the face of the unknown. The scene fades, the clatter of the horse-drawn cart receding into the distance as we return to the present day. The world we live in now, with its advanced medical knowledge, its hospitals and clinics, its antibiotics and vaccines, is a far cry from the dark and uncertain times of the medieval barber surgeon. But as we reflect on how far we've come, it's important also to remember how much farther we still have to go. Even with all our modern advancements, disease and illness remain a constant threat, a reminder of our own fragility and the limits of our understanding. In many parts of the world, people still live and die in conditions not so different from those of the medieval peasant, their lives beset by poverty, malnutrition, and lack of access to basic healthcare. Even in the most developed nations, the spectre of pandemics, chronic illness, and health disparities looms large. And so, as we lay ourselves down to sleep, our minds filled with the images and stories of a distant and difficult past, let us not forget the challenges that still lie ahead. The journey towards a world of true health and well-being for all is far from over, and it will take the efforts and dedication of countless healers, researchers, and everyday people to see it through. But just as the medieval barber surgeon found hope and purpose in his calling, despite the overwhelming odds, so too can we find strength and inspiration in the knowledge that we are part of a great and ongoing struggle. A struggle to ease suffering, to promote understanding, and to build a better, healthier world. The barber surgeon's arrival brought a mix of hope and apprehension to the town. On one hand, people were desperate for any kind of medical aid in the face of so much suffering and loss. The mere presence of someone claiming to have healing skills boosted morale. Yet there was also an undercurrent of unease. Barber surgeons had a reputation for causing more harm than good with their crude and painful treatments. As the barber surgeon set up his makeshift practice in the town square, a queue of townsfolk quickly formed, each waiting their turn to be seen. Many were there out of sheer desperation, willing to try anything to ease their loved one's suffering. Others sought treatment for more mundane complaints, like toothaches or persistent headaches. Little did they know, even routine procedures could be deadly in the hands of an untrained medieval practitioner. The barber surgeon worked with swift, practiced motions, his razor-sharp blades flashing in the sunlight. One of his favored treatments was bloodletting, the practice of draining excess or bad blood from the body in an attempt to restore balance. He claimed it could cure everything from fevers to melancholy. In reality, it only weakened the already frail and ill, sometimes sending them into shock from blood loss. Other times, the barber surgeon would reach for his jar of leashes, believing that the worm-like creatures could suck out disease. He would apply them to a patient's skin and wait for them to engorge themselves on blood. Removing the leeches often caused further bleeding and left patients with painful, itchy wounds. It's no wonder that many people feared a visit to the barber surgeon more than the ailments themselves. For those suffering from mental afflictions, the barber surgeon might attempt trepanation, the practice of drilling holes into the skull. The belief was that this would release evil spirits or alleviate pressure on the brain. In actuality, it often led to infection, brain damage, and death. It's a stark reminder of just how little was understood about the workings of the human body and mind in medieval times. Despite the barbaric nature of these treatments, the barber surgeon was often the only option for people who fell ill. Trained physicians were rare and typically only served the wealthy elite. Monasteries offered some care for the sick, but they were often overwhelmed and under-equipped. For most people, the choice was either to suffer in silence or take their chances with a local healer, no matter how dangerous or misguided their methods might be. As word of the barber surgeon's presence spread, more and more desperate townsfolk arrived seeking his services. Some walked away feeling relieved, convinced that the painful treatments had done some good. Others weren't so lucky. Over the coming days and weeks, many of those who had been bled or leeched took a turn for the worse, growing weaker and more feverish. For some, a visit to the barber surgeon would be their last. It's a grim reminder of the harsh realities of life in the Middle Ages, in a time when even a simple cut could lead to a deadly infection, and when diseases like the plague could wipe out entire communities. People were willing to try anything for a chance at survival. The barber surgeon, with his crude tools and misguided theories, offered a glimmer of hope in a world full of fear and suffering. Yet the sad truth is that more often than not, medieval medicine did more harm than good. Without a clear understanding of the causes of disease, healers were working blindly, guessing at cures, and often making matters worse. It would be centuries before the scientific method and evidence-based medicine began to replace superstition and tradition. In the meantime, countless lives were lost to treatable illnesses and well-meaning but ultimately deadly treatments. As the barber surgeon packed up his tools and moved on to the next town, the village was left to deal with the aftermath of his visit. Some would recover from their crude treatments and count themselves lucky. Others would succumb to infection or blood loss, leaving behind grieving families and a sense of helplessness. It was a scene that played out again and again across medieval Europe, a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. For those who lived through it, the spectre of illness and death was a constant companion. It shaped every aspect of medieval life, from religious beliefs to social structures. In a world where any day could be your last, people clung to faith, superstition, and the desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, they might survive. It's a mindset that's hard to imagine from the comfort and safety of the modern world. Yet even today, with all our medical advances and scientific knowledge, we are not invincible. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a stark reminder of just how fragile our grip on health and life really is. It has echoes of the past, of the fear and uncertainty that gripped medieval communities during times of plague and pestilence. In a way, it's a reminder to be grateful for the incredible progress we've made, but also to remain humble in the face of the incredible power of nature. We may have come a long way from the days of barber surgeons and bloodletting, but we are still vulnerable, still at the mercy of forces beyond our control. It's a lesson that our medieval ancestors knew all too well, that life is precious and that every moment should be cherished. As we look back on the grim realities of medieval medicine, it's easy to feel a sense of superiority, a belief that we have conquered disease and death. But the truth is more complicated. Yes, we have made incredible strides, and we should be proud of the advances that have saved countless lives. But we must also remember that we are part of a long and ongoing struggle, a battle against illness and suffering that has been waged for centuries. In the face of that struggle, the resilience and courage of our ancestors is something to be admired and celebrated. They faced unimaginable hardships with grace and determination, finding hope and meaning in even the darkest of times. It's a legacy that we carry with us, a reminder that even in the face of great adversity, the human spirit can endure. So as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for those who came before us, for the countless souls who suffered and died in a world without modern medicine. Let us honor their memory by cherishing the incredible gift of health and life that we have been given. And let us face the challenges of our own time with the same resilience, courage, and hope that sustained our ancestors through the darkest days of the Middle Ages. As the barber surgeon packed up his tools and moved on to the next town, he left behind a trail of suffering and confusion. The townsfolk were left to ponder the efficacy of his treatments, many of which seemed to cause more harm than good. The practice of bloodletting, in particular, raised eyebrows and sparked heated debates. The theory behind bloodletting was that it would remove the bad blood from the body, thus restoring balance to the humours. However, in reality, it often left patients weakened and vulnerable to further illness. The sight of a pale, listless patient with multiple cuts on their arms was all too common in medieval times. Leeching was another popular treatment that often did more harm than good. The small, slimy creatures were applied to the skin in the hopes that they would suck out the bad blood and heal the patient. However, many patients found the experience to be painful and unsettling, and the loss of blood often left them feeling drained and weak. Perhaps the most frightening of all medieval medical practices was trepanning. This involved drilling a hole into the patient's skull in order to release evil spirits or alleviate pressure on the brain. It's hard to imagine the sheer terror that patients must have felt as they lay on the operating table, watching the barber surgeon approach with his crude drill. Despite the best efforts of medieval healers, many patients suffered greatly at their hands. The lack of proper training and understanding of the human body meant that treatments were often misguided and dangerous. It was not uncommon for patients to contract infections from unsterilized equipment or to suffer from the side effects of toxic remedies. One such patient was a young woman named Matilda. She had been suffering from a persistent cough and fever for weeks, and her family had grown desperate for a cure. They brought her to the local apothecary, who prescribed a concoction made from a variety of herbs and animal parts. Matilda dutifully drank the foul-smelling liquid, but her condition only worsened. She developed painful sores in her mouth and throat, and her fever spiked to dangerous levels. Her family watched helplessly as she writhed in agony, unable to find relief from her suffering. Stories like Matilda's were all too common in medieval times. The miasma theory, which held that disease was caused by bad air, led many people astray in their search for a cure. They would burn sweet-smelling herbs and carry pomanders filled with perfume in the hopes of warding off illness. Little did they know that the real culprits were the unseen microbes that lurked in the filth and squalor of medieval life. Monasteries and apothecaries were often seen as centers of healing in medieval times. Monks and nuns would grow medicinal herbs in their gardens and prepare remedies for the sick and suffering. They believed that it was their holy duty to care for the ill, and that by doing so, they were serving God. However, even these well-intentioned healers were often working with limited knowledge and resources. They relied heavily on ancient texts and traditional remedies, many of which had little basis in scientific fact. They also lacked the understanding of basic hygiene and sanitation that we take for granted today. Despite the best efforts of medieval healers, the toll of endemic diseases was staggering. Dysentery, typhoid fever, smallpox, and tuberculosis were constant threats to the health and well-being of the population. These diseases would sweep through entire villages, leaving a trail of suffering and death in their wake. The symptoms of these illnesses were often horrific and painful. Dysentery, for example, caused severe diarrhea and abdominal cramping, leaving victims dehydrated and weak. Smallpox, on the other hand, caused a rash of painful blisters that could leave survivors scarred for life. Families were often struck repeatedly by tragedy, losing multiple members to the same disease. It was not uncommon for parents to bury several of their children before they reached adulthood. The emotional toll of such losses was immeasurable, leaving entire communities gripped by grief and despair. The spread of endemic diseases was fueled by a perfect storm of factors. Poor sanitation and lack of clean water meant that disease-causing microbes could easily spread from person to person. Malnutrition and famine weakened people's immune systems, making them more susceptible to illness. And the close quarters of medieval life, with multiple families often sharing the same small living spaces, meant that diseases could quickly spread through entire households. Even those in positions of power were not immune to the ravages of disease. Armies were often weakened by outbreaks of dysentery and other illnesses, leaving them vulnerable to defeat on the battlefield. Kings and queens, despite their wealth and privilege, could fall victim to the same diseases as their subjects. The story of King Richard III of England is a prime example of the toll that endemic diseases could take on even the most powerful of individuals. Richard was known for his military prowess and strategic mind, but he was ultimately undone by a simple case of dysentery. While leading his troops in battle against Henry Tudor in 1485, Richard fell ill with the disease. Despite his best efforts to push through the pain and discomfort, he grew weaker by the day. On the morning of the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard was so weakened by his illness that he had to be helped onto his horse. In the heat of battle, Richard fought bravely, but his strength was no match for the disease that ravaged his body. He was ultimately killed in combat, his body left to rot on the battlefield. It was a tragic end for a man who had once been one of the most powerful figures in England. The story of Richard III is just one of many examples of how endemic diseases could strike down even the most powerful and influential individuals in medieval society. No one was immune to the ravages of illness, and the constant threat of disease cast a long shadow over daily life. In the face of such overwhelming odds, it's no wonder that many people turned to religion and superstition for comfort and guidance. The power of prayer and holy relics was seen as a last resort for those who had exhausted all other options. People would make pilgrimages to holy sites in the hopes of finding a cure for their ailments, or would carry talismans and amulets to ward off evil spirits. However, even religion could not always provide the answers that people so desperately sought. During times of plague and widespread illness, many people saw disease as a punishment from God, a sign of his wrath and displeasure. This belief led to the rise of the flagellants, groups of religious zealots who would publicly whip themselves in an attempt to atone for their sins and appease God's anger. The flagellants believed that by inflicting pain upon themselves, they could take on the suffering of the world and offer it up to God as a sacrifice. They would march through the streets, chanting prayers and hymns, their backs raw and bleeding from the repeated lashes of the whip. However, the flagellants' actions often had the opposite of their intended effect. Rather than stopping the spread of disease, their public displays of penance may have actually contributed to its spread. As they gathered in large crowds and shared contaminated whips and clothing, the belief in divine punishment also led to the scapegoating and persecution of minority groups during times of plague. Jews, in particular, were often blamed for outbreaks of disease, accused of poisoning wells and spreading illness through nefarious means. These accusations often led to violent attacks and pogroms against Jewish communities, with entire neighborhoods being burned to the ground and their inhabitants slaughtered. The tragedy of these attacks was compounded by the fact that they did nothing to stop the spread of disease and only served to further divide and weaken medieval society. Despite the many challenges and obstacles that medieval people faced in the fight against disease, there were some glimmers of hope and progress. In the Islamic world, scholars like Ibn Sina were making important advances in medicine, building on the knowledge of ancient Greek and Roman texts to develop new treatments and understandings of the human body. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, written in the 11th century, became a standard text in medical schools across the Islamic world and beyond. It contained detailed descriptions of diseases and their treatments, as well as insights into anatomy, physiology, and pharmacology. In Europe, the establishment of medical schools like the one in Salerno, Italy, marked an important step forward in the professionalization of medicine. These schools trained a new generation of doctors and surgeons who were equipped with the latest knowledge and techniques for treating illness and injury. However, even with these advances, the practice of medicine in medieval times was still primitive by modern standards. Many treatments were based on superstition and folklore rather than scientific evidence. And even the most skilled doctors were limited by the tools and technologies available to them. Despite these limitations, there were some success stories in medieval medicine. Herbal remedies, in particular, could be effective in treating a range of ailments, from digestive issues to skin conditions. And the establishment of early hospitals, often attached to monasteries or religious orders, provided a place for the sick and injured to receive care and comfort in their time of need. As we return to our plague-stricken village, years after the barber surgeon's visit, we see some signs of progress and hope amidst the sorrow and despair. The streets are cleaner now, with gutters and public sanitation systems in place to help control waste and disease spread. Those who have survived the plague have learned hard lessons about the importance of hygiene and cleanliness. They keep their homes swept and their water sources protected, knowing that these small actions can make a big difference in the fight against illness. And while the spectre of disease still looms large over medieval life, there is a sense of resilience and determination among the survivors. They have seen the worst that illness can bring, and they have come out the other side, stronger and wiser for their struggles. Looking back from our modern vantage point, it's easy to see how far we've come in the fight against disease. With the advent of vaccines, antibiotics, and other medical advances, we have tools at our disposal that would have been unimaginable to our medieval ancestors. However, we also know that the battle against illness is far from over. New diseases emerge every year, and old ones continue to evolve and adapt. We must remain vigilant and dedicated in our efforts to combat these threats, learning from the hard-won lessons of the past. As we reflect on the story of disease in medieval times, we are reminded of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing the time we have with those we love. We may not face the same challenges as our ancestors did, but we can still learn from their strength, their resilience, and their unwavering determination to survive and thrive in the face of adversity. And so, as we drift off to sleep, our minds filled with the stories of medieval life, we can take comfort in the knowledge that we are part of a long and ongoing human struggle against disease and suffering. It is a struggle that has shaped our history and our very nature as a species, and one that will continue to define us for generations to come. As the barber surgeon made his way into town, his cart laden with an array of instruments and tonics, he was greeted by a mixture of hope and apprehension from the locals. In an age where medical knowledge was limited and often misguided, these travelling healers were seen as both saviours and harbingers of doom. The townsfolk gathered around, desperate for any relief from the myriad of ailments that plagued their daily lives. The barber surgeon set up his makeshift clinic in the town square, unfurling a banner promising cures for everything from toothaches to the dreaded buboes of the Black Death. He laid out his tools, a collection of razor-sharp blades, crude pliers, and a variety of potions and poultices. The sight was enough to make even the bravest soul quiver with fear. One by one, the sick and injured lined up to seek the barber surgeon's aid. A young boy, his face twisted in agony, was first. The child's mother explained that he had been suffering from a terrible fever and chills for days. Without hesitation, the barber surgeon reached for his fleam, a small, pointed blade used for bloodletting. "The bad humours must be released from the body," he proclaimed as he made a quick incision on the boy's arm, allowing the blood to flow freely. The boy whimpered in pain, but his mother held him still, hoping that this ancient practice would somehow cure her son. As the day wore on, the barber surgeon treated a variety of ailments using methods that would make a modern doctor cringe. He yanked out rotten teeth with his bare hands, poured boiling oil into open wounds, and even performed the occasional trepanation, drilling a hole into the skull to release evil spirits. Yet for all his efforts, the barber surgeon's treatments often did more harm than good. Many of his patients left his clinic in worse condition than when they arrived, their bodies weakened by blood loss and infection. Some wouldn't survive the ordeal, succumbing to the very illnesses they sought to cure. It was a reflection of the state of medicine in the Middle Ages, a time when superstition and ignorance reigned supreme. The miasma theory, which held that disease was caused by foul odors, led people to carry aromatic herbs and spices to ward off illness. The belief that sickness was a punishment from God drove many to seek solace in prayer and pilgrimage rather than practical treatments. Even the most well-intentioned healers of the time, such as the monks and nuns, who tended to the sick in their monasteries, were limited by their lack of understanding of the human body and the true causes of disease. They relied on ancient texts and folklore to guide their treatments, often with tragic results. The apothecaries, with their vast collections of herbs and spices, were seen as the pharmacists of their day. They dispensed remedies for everything from headaches to heart trouble, but their concoctions were often little more than placebos, or, at worst, poison. Without any regulation or standardization, the quality and safety of their medicines varied wildly. As the barber surgeon packed up his tools and moved on to the next town, the villagers were left to ponder their fate. Some would recover from their illnesses, their bodies somehow finding the strength to fight off infection and disease. Others would not be so lucky, their lives cut short by the cruel hand of medieval medicine. For the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, falling ill was a terrifying prospect. With no real understanding of how diseases spread or how to effectively treat them, they were at the mercy of chance and the dubious skills of the healers of the time. It was a world where a simple cut could turn deadly, where a fever could signal the end of a life. And yet, even in the midst of such darkness, there were glimmers of hope. In the Islamic world, scholars like Ibn Sina were making groundbreaking discoveries in anatomy and physiology, laying the foundation for modern medicine. In Europe, the establishment of early medical schools, like the one in Salerno, Italy, hinted at a brighter future. But for the common folk of the Middle Ages, these advances were still centuries away. They lived and died by the old ways, their lives a constant battle against the unseen forces of disease and decay. It was a time when getting sick meant facing the very real possibility of death, a fate that seemed almost inevitable in a world so full of danger and uncertainty. As we look back on this dark chapter in human history, we can't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the medical knowledge and resources we have today. We take for granted the antibiotics, vaccines, and surgical techniques that have saved countless lives and transformed the way we treat illness and injury. Yet even with all our progress, we are still vulnerable to the forces of nature and the frailties of the human body. The COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us of this fact, pulling us back to a time when a single virus could bring the world to its knees. In a way, the story of medieval medicine is a cautionary tale, a reminder of how far we've come and how much we still have to learn. It's a story of human resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity, of the enduring search for healing and hope in even the darkest of times. As we drift off to sleep, let us dream of a future where the scourges of disease and suffering are nothing more than distant memories, where the wisdom of the past combines with the knowledge of the present to create a world of health and harmony. For in the end, the story of medicine is the story of us all, a tale of trial and error, of tragedy and triumph, of the unending quest to unlock the mysteries of life itself. In the heart of the bustling city of Isfahan, located in what is now modern-day Iran, a renowned scholar pored over ancient medical texts late into the night. The flickering candlelight illuminated the stacks of parchment and vellum, casting dancing shadows on the walls of his study. This was no ordinary man, but the great polymath Ibn Sina, known to the West as Avicenna. Born in the year 980 AD, Ibn Sina's brilliant mind had already made groundbreaking contributions to philosophy, astronomy, and natural sciences. But it was his work in the field of medicine that would leave an indelible mark on history. As a young man, he had devoured the works of Greek and Roman physicians like Galen and Hippocrates. as well as the knowledge compiled by scholars of the Islamic Golden Age. Now, he sought to synthesize and expand upon their wisdom in his magnum opus, the Al-Qanun fi al-Tibb, or the Canon of Medicine. Night after night, Ibn Sina meticulously documented his observations on human anatomy, physiology, and the nature of disease. He described the symptoms and progression of maladies like meningitis, diabetes, and even cancer with remarkable accuracy. But his work went beyond mere description. Ibn Sina developed a holistic approach to medicine that considered the patient's overall health, environment, and lifestyle. He emphasized the importance of preventative care, nutrition, and even mental well-being, centuries before such concepts gained widespread acceptance in Europe. Ibn Sina's canon organized medical knowledge into a coherent system, classifying diseases based on their causes and affected organs. It laid out detailed guidelines for diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment, using both herbal remedies and surgical techniques. News of Ibn Sina's groundbreaking work slowly trickled westward along the Silk Road trade routes. The canon was translated into Latin in the 12th century, becoming required reading at major European universities. Scholars and physicians alike marveled at the depth and breadth of medical knowledge contained within its pages. The canon's influence on medieval medicine cannot be overstated. It introduced concepts like quarantine to control the spread of infectious diseases, as well as the use of anesthetics during surgery. Ibn Sina's meticulous documentation of pharmacological substances and their effects paved the way for the development of medicinal chemistry. His emphasis on clinical observation and empirical evidence helped to steer medical practice away from superstition and toward a more scientific approach. Of course, Ibn Sina's work was not without its flaws or detractors. Some of his theories, like the notion of humours governing human health, would eventually be disproven, and the canon's complexity and encyclopedic nature may have stifled original research in some areas, but its impact as a foundation for medical education and a bridge between ancient and modern medicine is undeniable. As the candle sputtered in the famed physician's study, Ibn Sina leaned back and reflected on his monumental undertaking. The canon was a labour of love, the culmination of a lifetime of learning and dedication to the art of healing. Little could he have imagined that his work would endure for centuries, shaping the course of medicine across continents and cultures. While Europe remained mired in superstition and primitive practices, the Islamic world continued to push the boundaries of medical knowledge. In the cosmopolitan city of Baghdad, the great Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid had established the House of Wisdom, a library and centre of learning that attracted scholars from across the known world. Here, translators worked tirelessly to render the wisdom of the Greeks, Persians, and Indians into Arabic, preserving and building upon the scientific heritage of the ancients. Among the eminent physicians who graced the halls of the House of Wisdom was Al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes. A man of insatiable curiosity and prodigious talent, Al-Razi made pioneering contributions to fields as diverse as chemistry, philosophy, and medicine. He was among the first to accurately describe the symptoms of smallpox and measles, and to suggest that these diseases were caused by specific agents that invaded the human body. Al-Razi's most enduring work, however, was his Kitab al-Hawi, or Comprehensive Book of Medicine. This massive tome compiled Al-Razi's own clinical observations with extensive excerpts from earlier medical texts. It contained detailed descriptions of diseases, their causes and symptoms, as well as therapeutic recommendations ranging from dietetics to surgery. Like Ibn Sina's canon, Al-Razi's comprehensive book helped to codify medical knowledge and establish a standard curriculum for physicians across the Islamic world. Translated into Latin as the Liber Continens, it shaped European medical practice well into the Renaissance era. But Al-Razi was more than just a compiler of knowledge. He was a true innovator who approached medicine with a critical and empirical eye. In his treatise on the fact that even skillful physicians cannot heal all diseases, he cautioned against the blind trust in authority and urged doctors to rely on their own observations and judgment. Al-Razi's emphasis on direct clinical experience and his willingness to challenge received wisdom set the stage for the scientific revolution that would transform medicine centuries later. As the golden age of Islamic science waned, its legacy lived on in the works of scholars like Ibn Sina and Al-Razi. Their writings preserved the flickering flame of classical learning through the long centuries of the medieval period. And when Europe began to awaken from its intellectual slumber, it was to the light of this knowledge that it turned. In the great medical schools of Salerno and Montpellier, the Canon and the Liber Continens were required reading for aspiring physicians. The Arabic texts were painstakingly translated into Latin, their secrets gradually unraveled and absorbed into the Western tradition. The Islamic world's emphasis on empiricism, observation, and rationality slowly began to take root in European soil. Of course, progress was halting and uneven. For every enlightened scholar who looked to the works of Ibn Sina and Al-Razi for guidance, there were scores of quacks and charlatans peddling superstitious remedies. The spectre of religious dogma and the weight of centuries of tradition still held sway over much of medieval medicine. But the seeds had been planted. The work of the great Islamic physicians had laid the foundation for a new kind of medicine, one based on reason and evidence rather than blind faith. It would take centuries for these ideas to fully flower, for the scientific method to be honed and refined, but the path had been lit, the way forward illuminated by the brilliant minds of the medieval Islamic world. As we look back on this pivotal era from the vantage point of our modern age, it's easy to focus on the darkness and ignorance that characterize so much of medieval life. The plague-ridden villages, the desperate superstitions, the cruel and misguided treatments. But amidst this bleak landscape, there were glimmers of light, flashes of brilliance that pointed the way to a brighter future. In the pages of the Canon and the Comprehensive Book, in the lecture halls of Salerno and the libraries of Baghdad, a quiet revolution was taking place. A revolution of the mind, a slow but inexorable shift toward a new way of seeing the world and our place within it. A world in which reason could triumph over superstition, in which the mysteries of the human body might one day be unlocked through patient study and careful observation. We are the heirs to this legacy, the beneficiaries of the tireless efforts of scholars like Ibn Sina and Al-Razi. Every time we visit a doctor's office or take a prescribed medication, we are drawing on the wisdom and ingenuity of these medieval pioneers. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit endures, that the quest for knowledge and understanding can never be fully extinguished. So let us pause for a moment to remember these unsung heroes of medieval medicine. Let us honor their achievements and their sacrifices, their unwavering commitment to the art of healing. And let us carry forward their legacy, striving always to expand the boundaries of what is possible, to light the way for those who will follow in our footsteps. In the end, the story of medieval medicine is a story of hope and resilience, of the enduring power of the human intellect to overcome even the darkest of challenges. It is a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable suffering and loss, there are always those who will rise up to fight for a better tomorrow. May we never forget their example, and may we always strive to be worthy of their legacy. As the Islamic world made strides in medical knowledge, glimmers of progress could also be seen in Europe's medieval universities. The medical school at Salerno, established in the 9th century, became a renowned center of learning. Students from across Europe flocked to this coastal town in southern Italy, eager to study the healing arts. The Salerno school was unique for its time, as it welcomed both male and female students. Women like Trota of Salerno one of the earliest known female physicians, played a vital role in advancing medical knowledge. Her writings on women's health issues were widely circulated and influenced medical practice for centuries to come. The curriculum at Salerno was heavily influenced by the works of ancient Greek and Roman physicians, such as Hippocrates and Galen. Students pored over these classic texts, memorizing the humoral theory of medicine and learning about the importance of diet, exercise, and hygiene in maintaining health. But they also gained practical experience, observing their professors as they treated patients and even performing surgeries themselves. This hands-on approach to medical education was a departure from the purely theoretical learning that dominated most medieval universities. The school at Salerno also had a medicinal garden, where students could learn about the healing properties of various plants and herbs. The use of botanical remedies was an important part of medieval medicine, and the knowledge of which plants could cure which ailments was passed down from generation to generation. One such remedy was the use of willow bark to relieve pain and fever. The active ingredient in willow bark, salicin, would later be synthesized to create aspirin, one of the most widely used drugs in the modern world. Other herbal remedies were less effective, and some were downright dangerous. Mandrake root, for example, was used as a sedative and pain reliever, but it could also cause hallucinations, coma, and even death if the dosage was too high. Despite these risks, the use of medicinal plants was often the only treatment available to medieval people. In a time before antibiotics and modern pharmaceuticals, herbs and natural remedies offered a glimmer of hope in the face of illness and disease. As the medical school at Salerno gained renown, other universities began to establish their own medical faculties. The University of Montpellier in France, founded in the 12th century, became another important center of medical learning. Here, students learned anatomy by dissecting pigs, as human dissection was still forbidden by the church. They also studied the works of Arab physicians like Ibn Sina and Al-Razi, whose writings had been translated into Latin and were beginning to circulate in Europe. These small advances in medical education and knowledge offered a glimmer of hope in the often bleak landscape of medieval healthcare. But for the vast majority of people, life remained a constant struggle against illness and premature death. As we come to the end of our journey through the history of medicine in medieval times, we return to that small village where our story began. Years have passed since the plague first struck, claiming the lives of so many. The village has changed in small but significant ways. The streets are a bit cleaner now, with gutters to carry away waste and filth. The local monastery has established a small hospital where the sick can come to receive care and comfort in their final days. But the spectre of illness and death still looms large over everyday life. Children still die of dysentery and smallpox, and adults are carried off by tuberculosis and other endemic diseases. The life expectancy remains pitifully low, and few people live to see their 50th birthday. Yet there is a resilience and a determination among the survivors. They carry on, tending to their fields and their families, finding moments of joy and laughter amidst the hardships. They remember those they have lost, and they hold fast to the hope that someday things will be better. As we reflect on the medical practices of the medieval era, it's easy to feel a sense of superiority from our modern vantage point. We have antibiotics and vaccines, X-rays and MRIs, sterile surgical techniques, and powerful pain medications. But we also face new challenges: chronic diseases, antibiotic-resistant superbugs, and the ever-present threat of global pandemics. We have come so far, but in many ways, we are still grappling with the same fundamental questions that confronted our medieval ancestors: how to alleviate suffering, how to prolong life, how to find meaning and purpose in the face of our own mortality. In the end, perhaps the greatest lesson we can take from the history of medieval medicine is one of humility and compassion. We are all vulnerable to the ravages of illness and disease, and we all deserve access to the best possible care and treatment, regardless of our station in life. So let us honor the memory of those who came before us, the healers and the sufferers, the heroes and the victims. And let us work towards a future where good health is a right, not a privilege.